Hi, this is Naomi Bennette, and I'm one of your lecturers for these series of astrology lessons. We're going to go back through some of the old history of astrology for the intermediate students, but this is good for the beginner students too, because we're going to go through the foundational structure of how astrology was formed, specifically with the signs and the rulership of the planets. We'll go a little bit into the sun and how it moves through the year, because it's a basic astronomical understanding. Because this subject was originally done way back in antiquity, long before recorded history. And we have books that were done in Hellenistic Egypt, but they were written by the Greeks. But even they have recognized that it was the Egyptians who created horoscopic astrology. And this is covered in my book, Foundations of Astrology. And I have a brand new book that's coming out this year. Actually, it's already been released on Amazon, on eclipses and moon wobbles, which are two of the oldest and strongest aspects in astrology. It goes all the way back to 2000 BC with the Chinese. So part of this lecture is called Solving the Astrological Puzzle, because for 2000 years, we have added on techniques and beliefs and capabilities that have just accumulated into astrology, and we've lost some of the astronomical foundations of how it was originally designed. And that's what this lecture is about. So I always love this joking cartoon. It's supposed to be a diss, a hit on astrology, but I think it's actually a compliment, which is the last panel. In the old days, I just gave people the first available slot. It was chaos. So now you use the science of astrology. It's better than science. It's an art. And it is. It takes a bit of an art to be able to do this. And this is another great quote, that astrology is like gravity. You don't have to believe in it for it to be working in your life. So it functions whether we pay attention to it or not. And I always invoke two planets in all of my lectures. One is Jupiter, because it is knowable knowledge, truth, understanding, and it pushes our society into a greater, more positive whole for the best of humanity. And then I always bring in Venus, because I think it's one of the major rulers of astrology, because it's about balance, design, cosmic harmony, and it's about drawing people together. So these are the two great benefics that are honored in astrology, and I invoke them here in our lecture for you to open your ears and think of new possibilities. So for some of the students of astrology, the modern astrology really started back up in the 19th century with the British astrologers, particularly Helen Blavatsky of the Theosophy Society. And she was greatly influential of Alan Leo, who started the Astrological Lodge. But there's a link between the British astrologers and the American, and that link is Aleister Crowley, who has an outrageous reputation, but he also happened to be the ghostwriter for Evangeline Adams. So this is the link between the most famous American astrologer in the 1920s and the British, because he actually ghostwrote her first books. And then he got very upset because she didn't get paid either. And so into the more modern form of astrologers, we have Sidney K. Bennett, and in the 20s and 30s, they used pseudonyms, so he was known as Wynn's Astrology. Grant Louis, Carl Payne Toby, who was my teacher, Charles Jane for eclipses, John Rowe, who became famous for financial astrology, and Dane Rudyard, who brought in psychological concepts into older astrology. And so these are what this enclave of New York astrologers who started the New York Astrology magazines in the 30s and 40s, and Sun Sign Astrology. These are some of the founders, and they all knew each other. They all socialized with each other because they were all in New York. And they were a group trying to uncover what made astrology work. So since that time in the 90s, and since the 90s, why we have had this revival of ancient astrology, which is redoing the Greek and the Latin texts into revised forms by the three Roberts, Robert Hand, Zoller, and Schmidt. And then we've had another revision, another layer from James Holden, Dr. Dykes, and Chris Brennan. And then on the evolutionary psychological side, Dane Rudyard, who evolved into Green. I'm trying to remember Green's first name. I want to say Stephen, but that's wrong. It's Stephen Forrester. And then the financial astrology, two of the big names is Ray Merriman and Bill Meridian. Jeffrey Wolf Green, yes. Who his daughter is teaching his classes now, but I understand he's alive, but inaccessible to his astrology students. So his daughter runs his astrology school. So here's my teacher, Carl Payne Toby. He's been forgotten by astrologers because all of his books and references were out of print, but I have republished them because he was our first statistician. He did our first statistical research, and it's very valuable material that's worth giving back to the astrological community, which I have done over the years. So he's a very valuable resource, but one that had been forgotten over time. So this is one of his quotes for our students. Astrology is the key to everything. Well, that's a big boast. It will not solve all problems overnight, but it will ultimately show you how to solve all problems. It obliterates ignorance. It's easy to learn, and you can be an astrologer. So whatever level that you want to take this understanding into, you can use it every day in your life, whether it's just looking up your daily horoscope, or you're following the ephemeris, or you're going to get deep and be a very serious student. All those levels will add value to your life. So we're going to go back into those foundations, which is that horoscopic astrology started before the Greeks. That's our first books that we have on astrology, but they learned it from the Egyptians. And it's my contention that astrology is really a form of mathematics. It's a form of geometry. And since the 1970s, there's been developed this form of geometry called fractal geometry. And astrology fits into this form of mathematics very, very easily. So this is actually a mathematical formula, but it was done in picture form. And it's done about proportions, and it's telling you something about life. But unless you have the eyes to see, unless you have the knowledge to decipher the picture, there's hidden knowledge in this picture that you would never recognize otherwise. Now, someone thought that an erect penis was offensive, so it's been chiseled out, but it's actually a very important form of geometry and proportion. So here is actually the mathematical formula that's given, and we give the Greeks and Pythagoras the discovery of geometry, but in reality, the ancient world, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Egyptians all knew this geometry. They just did it in a different form than we're used to recognizing. And so it's actually telling you the proportions of phi as the proportions of the body. It's actually the Pythagorean theorem of how right triangles work, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, basically this old picture is giving you that formula in the image. It's just not in the form that we're used to seeing. So here's another example. This is the tomb of Petrosiris. He was one of the great Egyptian astrologers that the Greeks learned from, and he has still an existing tomb. And within that, they called him the Great of Five, because 5 is related to the square root of 5, which is PHI, and it rules the shape and form of all life on Earth. So believe it or not, that's another mathematical formula that's giving you the secrets of pi and phi and the two-ness, three-ness, and four-ness that we use in astrology. So that's my invocation for you, is that this is a voyage of discovery, not in having new landscapes, but in having new eyes to open up and be perceptive to things that you weren't aware of before. Nikola Tesla, one of our great inventors of electricity, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And then this is very relevant to astrology. The Egyptians said, all is angle. So when we deal with these geometric shapes in astrology, we're dealing with angles, and we're saying angles and number have quality, not just quantity. So there's other lectures we could give, but this is just a little taste to give you that example, that the Great Pyramid, each face of the Great Pyramid was a ratio, an exact ratio proportion of the Northern Hemisphere, and each face was a quarter of that. The base of the Great Pyramid equals our diameter on Earth, and it's accurate all the way up to the North Pole. It was perfectly aligned to north, south, east, and west, and even our modern engineers couldn't do a better job than what the ancients had done 2,500 years ago. So this other principle that number has quality is that we can say that from the one, which could be God, is that you can create the many. And so we have a Japanese image down here at the bottom, but this is also true if we use number. So if we come here at the bottom, this little square, each side is the unit of one. If we take that diagonal and draw that diagonal, it will create another square that's equal to exactly 2. We take the next diagonal, it will create a square of 3. We take another diagonal, a square of 4, another diagonal, the square of 5. So the concept of one from the many, the Egyptians understood this, that from one, that you could generate with the square root of 2 every whole number out to infinity. And they did this by proportion and design. So when we deal in astrology with the number 2, we're dealing with duality and the square root of 2 as a generative number, that it's a number of creation and it's a number of power. So we will say many of our aspects are hard aspects because they're based on the number 2, or we will say some of our aspects are soft aspects because they're based on the number 3. So the square root of 3, another generative energetic number, is the basis of the Vesica Pisces, because it's a generative number of positivism and of growth. And we show this now in the form of Jesus Christ inside the Vesica Pisces, this right here. Can you see my arrow when I move my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. And in this square, this Vesica Pisces of power, it is surrounded by the fixed signs of the zodiac. Now they call them the archangels in the Catholic Church, but notice they use the fixed cross and the fixed signs because that represented rulership and power and authority in the ancient world. And in the very ancient world, you really weren't allowed to be a ruler or leader if you didn't have the power and authority of the planets. And so they're invoking the power and authority of Leo versus Aquarius and of Scorpio versus Taurus. And you can see them in the image. The eagle is this Scorpio. Here at the bottom is Taurus. And then you have the man of Aquarius opposed by Leo the lion. But these numbers all are generative and have quality. So the next generative number is 4. So we use 2, 3, and 4, and 5 very specifically in astrology. And the pyramid is considered a sacred shape because it's the first three-dimensional object that contains the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. You start with the apex, which is the 1. You draw one line to the second point and you get a straight line. The third point will create a triangle, but the fourth point will create a three-dimensional object. And that's why the pyramid was considered so sacred. And so from the Vesica Pisces, from the use of these two circles, you can generate these square roots of these powerful square roots of 2, 3, and 5, and they're used all throughout archaeology and architecture, and they're foundational to astrology. So with the square root of 5, we get the creation of mankind and living matter in the earth. And again, they showed in the ancient world, the Egyptians were always sitting on the seat of power. But that seat of power of 5 is actually a hidden mathematical formula of changing 4 into 5 with the square root of 5. And so here's the mathematics behind this seat of power. And yet all of our basic designs in Earth, even the seed distribution in the head of a flower, the leaf distribution on plants, follow the Fibonacci numbers and the square root of 5. So these are 2 videos, if you could find them online, that will give you deeper information on the use of this fractal geometry that's totally related to astrology. And this very pale image, if you can see it, is the original sign of life, the Egyptian sign of life. And it actually has all of those square roots embedded into it, and along with the perfect circle and the square and the triangle. And this was the original drawings that they found in Egypt. And I have visited there 2 years ago. So we're going on that astrology follows fractal geometry. It's the basis of how a spiral in a shell is formed, or the spiral that's in a galaxy, and even the distribution of your, for example, this here is could be the veins of your vessels, from the vessels out to the capillaries, but it's also the distribution of a tree and the branching of a tree. It's the spiral inside of a flower. It's the very design of DNA. It's the basis of all living life in the universe is based on the Fibonacci series. So all of these are examples of Fibonacci and fractal geometry, which is what astrology really is. So inside these seats of power is the square root of 5 and of life on Earth as we know it. Let's go on. I think we've done enough of that. And this is constantly in ancient Egypt, you'll see the seat of power with the square root of 5 repeated over and over on the various walls. So this is the question: what is God? What is the foundation of life? Well, from the ancient world, they thought that the closest that we could get to this concept of the design of the universe, the things that form our structures, is that it's really the closest thing we have is mathematics. And it's that this is a good quote for us astrologers, that angle is fundamentally a relationship of 2 numbers. And when we get into advanced courses, we can talk about that. So when we start dividing astrology up, the first thing we do is we divide the signs into 6 and 6. Half of them are considered past signs, and the old name for that is feminine. But I like to give a more modern term, because then we have loaded words like masculine and feminine, and whether one is positive or negative. So let's also realize that astrology, when you draw up a chart, is a moment in time. And you want to analyze that as to whether it's holding you back to the past or whether the moment is pushing you into the future. And so the male signs were associated with yang. They're the future signs of the fire and the air. The other half, if we divided these 12 signs in half, are the past signs of yin and female. But they're all energetic. So when we, one more thing I want to say. Then when we take and divide up the elements, we have 4 elements, water and earth, and then they're always opposed from each other. So you'll always see, for example, that Pisces opposes Virgo, or that Scorpio opposes Taurus. Or in the future signs, you'll find that the fire sign Aries is always opposed by the air sign of Libra. And this is the balancing of forces of balancing emotion in your water signs versus the earth signs, which is containment and restriction, or giving it form. And on the energetic signs of the fire signs or the future signs is you have the energy and force to push to the future, but you must have the intellect to balance that off. And so carefully within astrology, we have these 2 circles which represent the 2. Each one of the elements is of 3, so you'll see 3 fire signs, but there's a total of 4 elements. So you get the 2, you get the 1, which is everything, the 2, the 3, and the 4. 4 is embedded within astrology's design and how they lay out the signs and how they oppose each other. So our goal in this lecture is to try and straighten up the Tower of Pisa, because astrology has some errors in it, and a little bit of astronomy will help correct that. And that's the goal of this lecture, is to see what was originally, how it was designed, and to give an idea of why we assign planets to signs. So this is the view of our solar system that we learn in school, with the sun in the center. And of course, in astrology, we do a geocentric point of view. But I want to point out is this, when I first studied astrology, it blew me away of how they assign planets to signs, because it didn't match the astronomy of the solar system that I learned in school, which is what you learned in school too. Because if we look at the Earth, Mars and Venus should be the 2 closest planets, but that's now how astrology assigned it. No, what they did in the original order is they said that the moon came first, and then the sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars. And I thought, are they crazy? Why would they do moon, sun, Venus, Mercury, Mars? Because that's not the order that we see in the solar system. Well, the Egyptians studied the night skies for 4,000 years. They learned a little something that we as moderns have forgotten, but you're going to find out why they did moon, sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars. So this is the thema mundi that you see if you've been studying astrology at all, which is they assign the sun to Leo, the moon to Cancer, and then they did dual rulership after that. Mercury to Gemini and Virgo, Venus to Libra and Taurus, Mars to Scorpio and Aries, Jupiter to Sagittarius and Pisces, Saturn to Capricorn and Aquarius. And for anyone who studies Vedic, this is the same concept that you see on your right if you were a Vedic astrologer. So this is one of the images I looked for, because in the 90s, I already had learned this astronomical concept from Carl Tobey, but I didn't have the evidence. So I started going to the Louvre Museum in Paris. I went to the British Museum in England, and I went to Egypt looking for the evidence to find the astronomical basis from this. and it was on this sarcophagus. And this is the goddess Nut, the goddess of the sky, and it's on the inside lids of a coffin. So when you go into a museum, they're always showing you the face of the person who died, which is the outside. But many of the coffins, the mummy looks up to the inside of the lid and looks into the goddess Nut with the signs of the zodiac going down her body. And the division between Cancer and Leo, which is between the moon and the sun, is very, very important. It's esoteric, it's hidden knowledge that most astrologers don't know. So these are other examples of how they drew the signs of the zodiac and the planets associated with them. And so here's the first clue. We're going to watch a video of Mercury. And this is from a geocentric point of view, because that's how we view the planets from Earth. And it's going to teach us something. So let's give it a little try. Oops, go back and watch the video. So that little yellow ball is the sun, and the center object is the Earth. So we're watching Mercury doing its motion from an Earth point of view, and those little loops or retrograde motion where the planet slows down. These are our interior planets between us and the sun. We're almost done. I ran this long enough to complete the pattern. All right, so what is the image telling us? What it's telling us is that from an Earth point of view, that Mercury, when it slows down in retrograde motion, it's between us and the sun, but that Mercury in its fast motion spends more time on the far side of the sun than it does to Earth. That means Mercury is physically farther away from us than the sun is. The sun is closer to us than Mercury from an average mean distance over time. That the sun is physically closer to us astronomically than Mercury is. So let's watch Venus, because it's got its secrets too. So this is over an 8-year period. The little blue loops are the retrograde motion of Venus. And it takes 8 years and 5 loops to do a complete cycle of Venus. Again, the object in the center is Earth. The little blue dot that's going around in one circle is the sun, and then Venus changes its motion. You can see how it makes a perfect 5-petaled flower that's associated with balance, design, and mathematics. And one more loop. And all of this done is with NASA calculations. It's not mine at all. So what is this telling us again? That between Earth and the sun, Venus spends more time on the far side of the sun away from us than it does on the Earth side. So that physically, from an average time over time distance, is that the sun is physically closer to us most of the year than Venus is. And that is why the ancients were smarter than we are when they said, from a geocentric point of view, that the moon is our closest object. Our second closest planet is the sun. then Mercury, then Venus. Well, this goes into the newly discovered planets, because when we discovered Uranus, the astrologers had no problem whatsoever of assigning Uranus to Aquarius. And when Neptune was discovered, they didn't have any doubt. They assigned Neptune to Pisces. But when Pluto was discovered, there was a huge debate, and it's never been solved, and I'm solving it for you today, which is, where do you assign Pluto? Do you give it to Aries or you give it to Scorpio? Because remember, Mars was the dual ruler of Scorpio and Aries. And I'm showing you today from that astronomy, it must be assigned to Pluto. Now, since 2005, there's another object out beyond Pluto that's just as big with the moon, and that's Eris. So if we do statistical probability, the astrologers unconsciously followed this design, this astronomical design of average mean distance from the Earth by, and what's the statistic? 6,600,000 to 1 that this is a coincidence. So I'm saying to you, as students of astrology, you really should assign Pluto to Aries. And if you want to, you can still give Mars dual rulership, but don't give Pluto rulership of Scorpio. That's a big mistake. And the Egyptians started this with horoscopic astrology, and I'm giving you the astronomical basis of why Pluto needs to be assigned to Aries and not do dual rulership with Scorpio. So where does the zodiac start? Because we just had March 21st, the astrology day, which they're saying that now in modern times that we start our astrological year on the first day of spring. But no, that's not where the Egyptians started it, and we're going to go through that. So the Egyptians started their new year on the first day of summer at 0 Cancer, which was the Egyptian New Year. It's when Sirius appeared with the rising of the Nile and the fertilization of all of the lands in Egypt. And they even moved their temples so that they could measure the center of the sun. The disk of the sun is a half a degree. They moved it so that they could be at 15 minutes, which is the quarter of that degree, to measure the center of the sun when it moved into Cancer. And the Egyptian zodiac, just like the Thema Mundi, starts with the moon and Cancer. And it's my contention that the proper way to measure the astrological year is with 0 Cancer and the moon, not with the spring. So how did the ancient world measure the year? They did stone circles. They measured the rising sun, and they measured the sun at the extremes of its declination, which is the winter solstice, or they measured the extremes of the summer solstice, and then they measured the equinoxes in between. They did this all over the ancient year. And we can see this change in declination as we plot the sun across the sky during the year, is that it forms this wave pattern. And we can measure the full height of the sun or the lowest point of the sun. And of course, if you're in the southern hemisphere, it's absolutely the opposite. And so here's an example of measuring the sunrise of the sun over the entire year. And you can see how it moves along the horizon. And so we also see that if that's why all of these stone circles usually have some point out in the distance where it's measuring the rising of the planets or the stars over the time and over the distances. There's pointers out to the horizon. And we see this here where it's being measured. Now note, just for the more intermediate astrologers, is that the moon and some of the planets like Mercury and Venus and Mars can go beyond the bounds of the sun, which is the Tropic of Capricorn, and that's called out of bounds. And the summer solstice, which is the Tropic of Cancer. So you can have the moon go 5 degrees beyond those points, which are called out of bounds planets. And this is how they measured them. And so when you measure the height of the sun over the year, it creates this curve pattern. And that's why in the ancient world, the most common form of the new year was the winter solstice for the northern horizon, because that was the lowest point of the sun. Literally at this point at the bottom, which is the winter solstice, is that it stands still, the sun stands still for 3 days while it turns directions from going south to north. And then at the height of summer, it comes all the way up to zero Cancer, where it stands still for 3 days while it turns from north to south, where it heads back down into the winter. So the logical place to measure the year is either at the winter solstice or the summer solstice, not in the middle. The reason why we have March now as the astrology day is that after the fall of Greece and Rome, that the only astrology that really survived on the western part of the world was in Persia. And the Persian astrologers maintained astrology for about 800 years before the West retrieved it back. And it was the Persians that always honored spring as their new year. But that's not where the new year has done traditionally, which is why we have Christmas. Originally, it was supposed to supplant Saturnalia, and it always had Christ being born on the winter solstice. It's because of the slippage of our calendar that it's now December the 25th, but it used to be December the 21st. Why did we have 12 days of Christmas? Because that's the number of days that Saturnalia was celebrated. So they were replacing the pagan holidays with Christian holidays and overlying their Christian beliefs with the pagan beliefs. So there comes a time in life when you walk away from all the drama and the people who create it. You surround yourself with people who make you laugh, forget the bad, focus on the good, love the people who treat you right, pray for the ones who don't. Life is too short to be anything but happy. Falling down is a part of life, and getting back up is living. I hope those are good words to remember. And then these are great proverbs too to leave you with. Obstacles don't block the path. They are the path. They're our learning experience. So when we have tough aspects in astrology, it's part of our learning experience to go through those times and come out whole, better than we did. Do not be dismayed by the brokenness of the world, which of course we have a lot right now. All things break, all things can be mended. Not with time, as they say, but with intention, our intention. So go love with love intentionally, extravagantly, unconditionally. The broken world awaits in darkness for the light that is you, that is us. And I hope I've given you a gift of learning the foundations of how astrology was designed, and that to realize that the astrological year begins with zero Cancer and the summer solstice, and that Pluto is the natural ruler of Aries. And hopefully you've learned just a little something new that you hadn't anticipated that will open doors for you in the future. And so I gift this class to you and wish you all the best. I have 2 books out on Amazon. If you're interested in the Carl Payne Toby books, they're all available on Amazon too. And only the best to you and yours. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks. Goodbye.